Fog from the Thames clung in slow-moving ribbons along the balustrade, and the lamplight above Westminster Bridge cast a jaundiced glow that seemed to shimmer upon the water below. I had scarcely turned to remark on the odd hue when Holmes bent down, his gloved finger brushing against a damp scrap caught in the stonework. It was no more than a thumbnail's breadth of paper, but the residue of a dark pigment had seeped into its fibers, giving off a faint metallic odor I could not place. He held it to his nostrils, then to the lamplight, his eyes narrowing with that quick, bird-like scrutiny I had come to know too well. "Printer's ink," I ventured, eager to forestall the inevitable correction. "Not merely ink, Watson," Holmes murmured, his tone clipped. "Observe the luster, lamp-black adulterated with aniline dye, a cheap forgery's breath." Before I could frame a reply, a sudden commotion drew our attention to the river's edge. A bargeman's lantern swung wildly in the mist, and a constable's whistle pierced the damp air. We hurried forward, Holmes striding with the impatience of a man who already knew what lay ahead. The body of a gentleman, well-dressed yet curiously disordered in appearance, had been dragged onto the flagstones. His cravat was missing, his left glove torn, and in the crook of his arm I glimpsed faint smudges. Ink once again, but pressed into the cloth in parallel strokes as though from the edge of some ledger or bound volume. Holmes crouched, fingers lightly tracing the marks. "A record of some kind," he said. "Our victim clutched it in his final struggle, or rather, it was forced against him. Either way, Westminster's shadows conceal more than fog." The constable, a stout man half suffocated by his own collar, blustered about jurisdiction and the necessity of summoning the yard. Holmes gave him a curt nod, then whispered to me with an almost mischievous glint, "This bridge is not merely a crossing, Watson. It is a stage, and upon its boards our victim has played his final scene." The man's watch chain, curiously intact though the fob was missing, gleamed in the gaslight. I stooped to examine it, remarking that the links seemed newly polished, despite the rest of the attire being somewhat bedraggled. Holmes only smiled faintly, and with that infuriating restraint pocketed the scrap of dyed paper without a word of explanation. Even as the constable signaled for assistance, Holmes's gaze had fixed upon the opposite embankment where a hansom cab lingered longer than necessity dictated. Its curtain shifted just perceptibly and was drawn again. Holmes's hand tightened on my sleeve. "Mark that cab, Watson. If I mistake not, the curtain conceals not the timid, but the watchful." And before I could so much as protest, Holmes had stepped back into the fog, his silhouette blending with the vapor, while I heard the echo of wheels begin to move across the bridge. The cab was retreating into the night, and Holmes, without hesitation, signaled for us to follow. The cab rattled across the bridge with a speed that spoke more of evasion than conveyance, its wheels scattering puddles into glistening arcs that caught the weak light of the lamps. Holmes hailed another hansom with a whistle so sharp it startled even the constable behind us, and in an instant we were in pursuit. The air, heavy with Thames mist, seeped into the cab's interior and dimmed even the lantern at our side, but Holmes, leaning forward with his hawk's profile sharpened by shadow, seemed oblivious to all discomfort. "Note the tread of its wheels, Watson," he said, his tone as brisk as if he were lecturing in his Baker Street armchair. "Do you observe how the left rear wheel strikes with an irregular cadence?" I strained to hear above the clatter. "It appears slightly warped." "Precisely. An honest cab will not run with such imbalance for long. When we find it halted, we will know it by the limping of its progress. In crime, as in typography, the flawed impression betrays the plate." That curious metaphor struck me even as I jotted it to memory. The second time he had referenced printing, ink, or records since we arrived upon the bridge. The image of ledgers, papers, impressions. He was building some invisible chain, one link at a time. The chase drew us eastward along the embankment, the other cab's outline, sometimes lost, sometimes recovered in the fog as if we pursued a phantom. At last it swung into a narrow byway near the temple, where the glow of gas lamps thinned and the air took on a tang of coal smoke. We jolted to a halt just as our quarry's wheels struck the curb, and the cab drew up against a nondescript door. Before I could alight, Holmes had vanished into the mist, moving noiselessly yet swiftly as only he could. I followed, though with the less graceful thud of boots on cobblestone, and caught him crouched near the cab's rear wheel. With a gesture for silence, he ran his finger along the warped rim, then stooped to the damp stones. He held up a minute trace caught against the rubber, a black dust clinging to his fingertip. "Printer's carbon," he muttered, so low I barely caught it. "Yes, the theatre of impressions again. Come, Watson, we must not be seen lingering." But the cab door opened then, and out stepped a man with a stiff carriage and broad shoulders, wrapped in an overcoat of military cut. He paid the driver without a word, then entered the door with the air of one expected. The brief glimpse I had of his profile, clean-shaven, stern, with a line of scar running from ear to jaw, remained vivid. Holmes had seen more. I could tell by the tension in his hand upon my arm. "We have our sentinel," Holmes whispered. "But the play is unfinished. Quick, back to the hansom before we are noticed." We returned to Baker Street under a sky that showed the first faint paling of dawn. I confess I was weary, chilled, and more than a little irritable at having been led in circles, but Holmes seemed possessed by that restless energy which comes upon him when the scent of a puzzle stirs his blood. No sooner had we removed our coats than he drew from his pocket the scrap of paper recovered at Westminster Bridge and laid it beneath the lamp. "There, Watson. Tell me what you see." I examined the fragment carefully. It was coarse, cheap paper, torn at the edge, and stained with the dark ink Holmes had earlier identified. What struck me now, however, were faint indentations, as though a heavy hand had pressed through from a sheet above it. I traced the shallow grooves with my finger, uncertain. "Someone has written upon it," I said, "but the words are indecipherable." "Not indecipherable, merely latent." Holmes produced a soft pencil and shaded lightly across the surface. Slowly, like a photograph developing in a bath, letters began to emerge. They formed not a name but figures, a column of numbers, each with a pound sign. At the margin, a mark resembling an initial, a looping C. "A ledger page," I exclaimed. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A page, yes, but torn from what book and by whose hand? These figures are not large enough for commerce, nor are they military accounts. Observe the irregular intervals. It is the record of discrete payments, not transactions of trade." I felt a stir of unease. "Blackmail?" He gave no answer, only took up his violin, running the bow across the strings in a low growl as he pondered. Then, with sudden violence, he set the instrument aside and reached for his hat. "Watson, we must call upon the Yard. Lestrade is ever punctual at his office at this hour, and I should like his sanction, however grudging, before we proceed further. For if I am correct, we stand upon the edge of something that threatens more than one reputation." The ride to Scotland Yard was made in silence, Holmes brooding with the ledger fragment in his hand, myself watching the pale city stir reluctantly into day. We found Lestrade in his office, eyes red-rimmed from a night of reports, yet quick to bristle at Holmes's intrusion. "You come with scraps and smudges, Mr. Holmes," he said tartly, "and expect me to conjure criminals from paper dust?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Paper dust may suffice where your force finds only smoke, Lestrade. But I come not merely with dust. There is a body on Westminster Bridge and a cab that limps with printer's soot. Will you disregard these?" The inspector's expression changed at mention of the bridge. He shuffled papers with an ill grace. "The man's identity remains unconfirmed. Some merchant or clerk, robbed and thrown down. It is commonplace enough." Holmes's gaze hardened. Then commonplace will serve us ill, for the numbers on this fragment, if my eye does not deceive, link to payments made in Whitehall itself. And your merchant or clerk died not of robbery, but of a pressure wound to the throat, his cravat torn to conceal the act. Look to his gloves. One is rent by fingernail. That was no accident. Lestrade muttered something about Holmes's eternal meddling, but promised, grudgingly, to send a man to trace the cab license. It was little, yet enough to satisfy Holmes for the moment. Back at Baker Street, as the fog burned away into a grey morning, I pressed him for more. "Holmes, you speak of Whitehall and payments. What can possibly be the connection between a dead man on the bridge, a scarred sentinel near the Temple, and ledger numbers scrawled on cheap paper?" Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "The connection, my dear fellow, lies in impressions. Just as a flawed type leaves its mark upon the page, so does guilt leave its impress upon those who imagine themselves invisible. We are reading a book where half the letters are invisible, and yet the sense may be discerned by those with patience." He rose, stretched, and paced the rug with quick strides. "There is one man in London who can confirm my suspicion if he dares, and dare he must, for the next scene in this shadow play is about to be enacted." He stopped abruptly at the window, his gaze fixing on the street below. I followed and saw there a young clerk in government livery mounting the steps to our door, a sealed envelope in hand. Holmes's eyes brightened with that peculiar fire that told me the chase had only begun. The knocker sounded. Holmes did not wait for Mrs. Hudson to announce the visitor. With the swiftness of a man who had expected this very knock, he opened the door himself, plucked the envelope from the startled clerk's hand, and closed the door with a briskness that left the young fellow staring at the painted number of Baker Street in mute surprise. The envelope was thick, sealed with the impress of a crest faintly blurred in the wax. Before I could remark upon it, Holmes had slit it open with his penknife and unfolded a single sheet of paper. His brow contracted as he read. I moved closer, and though he made no effort to conceal it, I knew enough of his habits to realize that the true significance would not lie in the words alone. The letter was brief, written in a hand of rigid neatness. "Sir, desist from inquiries into the matter of the bridge. Further scrutiny will serve neither the public nor your reputation. Take this as final." It was unsigned. Holmes held the sheet up to the lamplight, turning it this way and that. At once, he touched the margin with a dampened finger, then sniffed lightly. "Watson, the paper is laid from a mill near Maidstone. Common enough, but note—" He drew my attention to the faintest trace along the fold, a dull smudge that looked like ash. He rubbed it between finger and thumb, releasing a faint, acrid scent. "Coal soot?" I asked. "Hardly. This is char from a gas jet wick, precisely the sort used in the lamps of government offices. Whoever sent this writes his threats not in the back streets, but beneath the very dome of authority." I confess a shiver ran through me. "Holmes, if such men are involved, is it prudent—" He cut me short with a curt gesture. "Prudence is for accountants, Watson. Truth is another ledger altogether, and one must balance its columns even against the wishes of power." Again that motif of ledgers and impressions, it recurred in his speech as naturally as breath, though I could not yet perceive its final form. Holmes took up his magnifying lens, bent close to the sheet, and with a short laugh beckoned me. "Here, see this pressure mark at the foot, as though the nib paused and pressed more heavily before lifting." The writer hesitated. "Watson." He nearly signed his name, then thought better. "That tremor is not the mark of a hardened criminal, but of a man unused to threat. A bureaucrat, then, or someone compelled by fear." Before I could reply, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a card upon her tray. Holmes glanced at it, and for once his eyebrows rose. "Well, the stage manager himself. Show him in." The visitor who entered was a tall gentleman, impeccably dressed, his grey hair close cropped, his face lined by years of office and worry. He introduced himself as Sir Evelyn Rathbury, a permanent official attached to the Treasury. His voice was measured, his every movement cautious, as though each syllable and gesture must first pass the test of committee. "I come in confidence, Mr. Holmes," he began, "and at no small risk. The dead man found upon Westminster Bridge was one of ours, Mr. Harold Prynne, a confidential clerk. His duties touched upon sensitive papers. That much I admit to you and no further. We are anxious, deeply anxious, that no public stir be made of this matter. The consequences would be regrettable." Holmes regarded him with an expression I could not read. Regrettable to the Treasury, or to justice? Sir Evelyn stiffened. "You are known for your independence, Mr. Holmes, but I beg you consider that reputations, even those of nations, rest upon discretion. Leave this case. Let us settle it internally." Holmes steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. "Sir Evelyn, when a man is strangled upon the very bridge that leads to your offices, clutching in death the impress of payments best left unrecorded, it is no longer an internal matter. It is murder, and I shall pursue it." The official's lips tightened. He made to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he rose with stiff dignity. "I feared as much. You will do as you will, Mr. Holmes, yet I warn you, the shadows you stir will fall heavily." With that, he departed, leaving a silence thick with implication. Holmes broke it by pacing the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Watson, we are now certain of 2 points. First, Prynne was a clerk of the Treasury. Second, he knew of irregular payments, blackmail or bribery recorded in some ledger. For such knowledge, he was silenced. The scarred sentinel we observed is the hand of force. Rathbury and his fellows are the hand of concealment, the two clasped together." I could not restrain myself. "But Holmes, why involve us? Why risk warning you at all if they wished only to bury the matter?" Holmes halted. "Because the warning itself is a signal. They are divided, Watson. Some wish to frighten us off, others to enlist our silence. A fracture exists in their ranks, and it is through that seam we must press." At that moment, the bell rang sharply below. Holmes froze, head cocked, as the sound of firm steps ascended. A knock came, more peremptory than before. Mrs. Hudson ushered in Inspector Lestrade, his coat still damp from the river air. He wasted no time. "Holmes, we've traced the cab you spoke of. Belongs to a fellow named Judd, haunts the Temple precincts, but there's worse. The cab was found abandoned near St. Clement Danes. The horse loosed and Judd himself gone. No trace but a smear of ink on the inside curtain, as if a bottle had been knocked." Holmes's eyes lit with fierce satisfaction. "Ink again. Every impression leads us back to the press. Watson, do you see? Our phantom writes his own confession at every turn. Lestrade, you must secure the cab. Do not let a single trace be lost. The soot, the ink, the fibers. Treat it as the very stage upon which the play was performed." Lestrade grumbled, but I could see he was swayed by Holmes's intensity. He promised to send word the moment any analysis was possible. When he had gone, Holmes turned to me with sudden energy. "We must strike while the ink is still wet, Watson. I know of one printer's establishment, discreet and yet curiously entangled with government contracts. If Prynne's last clutch was against a ledger, it was one of theirs. Tonight we go to Blackfriars." The rest of the day he spent in restless preparation, dispatching notes, consulting volumes, and at intervals taking up his violin only to abandon it mid-phrase. As dusk gathered, we set out once more through the fog-bound streets, the lamps flickering in the river's haze. At Blackfriars we came upon a modest building whose windows glowed faintly, though the hour was late. Holmes approached the door with the wary confidence of a hunter nearing his quarry. He touched the frame with a gloved hand, then drew it back to reveal a dark smear upon the wood, ink thick and fresh. He bent low, examining the lock. "Watson, there has been a visitor not half an hour past. See here, the scratch upon the plate, the hurried pressure on the key. Someone else seeks the ledger we hunt. The street lay silent, save for the distant roll of a carriage. The fog clung closer, muffling all sound. Holmes pushed the door. It yielded a fraction before catching upon the latch. He raised a finger for silence, his ear inclined to the shadowed interior. And from within, faint but distinct, came the rustle of papers hastily closed and the scrape of a chair upon bare boards. Holmes's eyes met mine, gleaming in the half-light. He placed his hand upon the latch. The door began to open. The door creaked inward by inches, and a breath of stale ink and damp paper met us. Holmes motioned me back, then slipped inside with a feline noiselessness that belied the boards underfoot. I followed, my revolver instinctively in hand, though I was uncertain against what foe it might serve. The gaslight from the street lamp behind us trickled only a few feet into the gloom, but somewhere deeper in the shop a lamp glowed, throwing a cone of amber light upon a cluttered desk. A figure rose abruptly from behind it, scattering loose sheets to the floor. He was a wiry man, ink-stained at the cuffs, his hair standing wild from his scalp. For a heartbeat his eyes met ours with terror, then defiance, before he made a sudden dash for the rear door. Holmes was quicker. With a lunge he caught the man's sleeve and twisted him round so that he collided with a stack of ledgers, which toppled to the floor in a crash of bindings and dust. "Stay your hand, Watson," Holmes said, even as the fellow panted like a trapped animal. "This man's weapon is paper, not steel." "I know you," the man gasped, clutching at his collar. "Holmes, the meddler." "Call me meddler if you wish," Holmes said coldly. "But meddling has already brought me to your threshold. You will oblige us by explaining what papers you were so desperate to conceal." The man's lips tightened. "I know nothing of murder. I'm but a printer. I set type. I bind. I deliver." Holmes stooped, retrieving one of the fallen ledgers. His long fingers opened it at random, and he held it beneath the lamplight. "A printer indeed. But this is no mere record of pamphlets. Watson, see here. Columns of numbers, initials beside them. C.R.H. Payments of steady measure, though scattered irregularly." I bent closer, my medical training giving me little aid in deciphering financial codes, but I recognized the form. Discrete sums, each small, yet together amounting to thousands. Holmes turned the pages with increasing speed, his eyes keen. "Sir," he said to the trembling man, "these are the ghost ledgers of corruption, set in type not to be read, but to be hidden. Tell me, whose press runs these sheets?" The man shook his head violently. "I print what I am paid to print. The orders come through intermediaries. I never ask the names." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Yet you know them well enough to tremble when we enter. Your hands are blotted with more than ink." The fellow's composure broke. "They will kill me," he whispered, "as they killed the clerk." Holmes's voice softened fractionally. "Then save yourself by confession. What passed at Westminster Bridge?" The printer swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the door to the floor. "I cannot tell you. Only that Prynne came here. Twice. He demanded to see the books. He said he would expose the payments unless a greater sum was granted. After that, I saw him no more." I felt a chill. So he sought to blackmail those who already trafficked in blackmail. Holmes gave me a sharp glance. "Not blackmail, Watson. Extortion, perhaps. Or perhaps Prynne sought righteousness and made his last demand too boldly. The truth lies not in his motives, but in the ink." He riffled the ledger's pages until he paused at one where the figures had been roughly struck through. There, amid the scrawls, was a name written fully: Chesil. It had been half erased, yet still legible. Holmes tapped it. "A clumsy redactor. There is our first true impression." The printer cried out, "No, not that. You must not speak it." But Holmes had already closed the book and tucked it under his arm. "Enough. You will remain here, sir. Lestrade shall hear of this shop, and whether you serve as accomplice or as witness will depend upon your tongue when next you are questioned." The man sagged into his chair, defeated. Holmes drew me out swiftly into the night, the fog thickening as if the city itself sought to shroud the corruption of its heart. We had scarcely gone a dozen paces when Holmes halted beneath the gaslight and opened the ledger again. "Watson, observe the pattern of these initials. C.R.H. They recur at irregular intervals, but each is followed by the same sum, £25. Then after 3 such entries, another, 50. It is a code of allowance, a stipend for silence. Someone is paying for shadows." The name Chessel gleamed faintly where the eraser had failed. I frowned. "Do you know him?" Holmes's eyes were distant. "Sir Benedict Chessel, Member of Parliament, a man with a spotless record and the confidence of Whitehall. If this ledger is to be trusted, his name is entwined with sums he ought never to receive. Yet the trick lies here. It is too blatant, too carelessly left. No man of Chessel's caution would permit his name in so damning a register. Then it is a plant, perhaps. Or perhaps Chessel is a pawn in a larger game. But the imprint is clear. Someone wished us to find it." We returned to Baker Street in silence, the fog curling about the handom's wheels as though echoing the curls of ink on the ledger's page. When at last we sat again by our fire, Holmes placed the book on the table and regarded it as though it were a venomous reptile. "Watson, mark my words. This is no common corruption. It is a play within a play. One man is murdered, another's name left in half erasure, a warning sent under government seal. Each act leaves its impression, but the type is altered between printings. We must discover who sets the press." I pressed him. "And how shall we proceed?" He gave me one of his quick, bird-like smiles. "By confronting Sir Benedict Chessel himself. If guilt lies upon him, his manner will betray it. If innocence, then we shall learn who profits by the stain upon his name. Either way, we approach the heart of the shadow." The following afternoon found us driving through the wide avenues of Westminster toward Chessel's residence, a house of sober dignity with columns rising stark against the autumn sky. As we alighted, Holmes bent suddenly and plucked a fibre from the step. He held it up, a shred of coarse thread darkened by soot. "A visitor from the same hand that marked the cab," he murmured. "Our sentinel has passed this way." We were shown into a drawing-room where Sir Benedict soon joined us. He was a tall, imposing man, his manner that of a statesman conscious of his integrity. Yet when Holmes presented the ledger fragment without a word, I saw his colour shift, and his hand trembled before he steadied it upon the back of a chair. "Where did you obtain this?" he demanded. Holmes's voice was cool. "From a printer who fears for his life, and from the hand of a dead clerk who feared for his honour." For a moment, Chessel stared at the figures, his jaw clenched. Then he spoke with the dignity of a man wronged. "These are false. My enemies would ruin me, and now they stoop to forgery. I know nothing of these payments." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Then you will permit me to test your innocence by tracing the hand that wrote this name. For it was not yours, Sir Benedict. The question is, whose was it?" The silence that followed was broken only by the faint tick of the mantel clock. Chessel's eyes flicked just for an instant toward the curtained window, as though he feared that someone waited without. Holmes's gaze followed the glance. He said nothing, but I knew then that another presence lingered in this drama, watching, waiting, and that Holmes intended soon to draw the curtain aside. The latch upon the window stirred faintly. The curtain quivered as though stirred by a hand, and Holmes crossed the carpet in 2 swift strides. With a sudden wrench he drew it back, revealing not open air, but a half-raised sash. Beyond, clinging to the sill like some night prowler, crouched the scarred sentinel we had glimpsed from the cab, the soldierly figure with the seamed jaw. His eyes flashed once with recognition before he dropped to the gravel below and vanished into the mist with the sound of retreating boots. "Watson, after him," Holmes called. But even as we dashed to the garden path, the man was gone, swallowed by the fog-bound street. Only a trampled rose bush and a smear of soot on the sill bore witness to his presence. Sir Benedict stood rigid, his complexion pallid in the lamplight. "Good God, Holmes, what villainy is this? Who is that intruder?" Holmes closed the sash with a decisive snap. "That, Sir Benedict, is the shadow that dogs your name. He is the hand of force employed by those who would ruin you. His scar proclaims military service, yet his employer is no regiment, but a clandestine ledger. Did you not recognize him?" "I swear I did not," Chesil protested, though his hand trembled against the chair. "This persecution is monstrous. My life, my reputation—" Holmes cut him short. "Your reputation may yet be preserved, but only if you speak truth. Tell me, Sir Benedict, have you ever had dealings, direct or indirect, with a certain Harold Prynne?" At the mention of the murdered clerk, Chesil's composure faltered. He sank into the chair, his gaze upon the carpet. "Prynne? Yes, I knew him by sight. He was attached to the Treasury offices I sometimes visited. Once, only once, he approached me with a question about certain drafts I had endorsed. I dismissed him. I never imagined—" Holmes studied him with that piercing stillness which unnerved the boldest of men. At last he said quietly, "I believe you. You are the victim, not the architect, of this forgery. But someone has planted your name in the ledger to serve as both bait and shield. They ruin you in print, even as they employ violence in flesh." Chesil raised his eyes, desperation warring with dignity. "Can you save me from this snare, Holmes? My task is not to save, but to reveal. Yet revelation may serve salvation." Holmes rose, signaling our departure. Outside, the night air felt colder than before. He walked swiftly, his coat flaring behind him until we regained our cab. Once seated, he leaned close, his voice taut with suppressed energy. "Watson, the lines converge. The scarred man is no prowler, but a hired sentinel. His presence at Chesil's house proves the ledger's forgery is no clumsy chance. It is part of a concerted design. Someone wishes Chesil destroyed, yet does not dare strike him openly. Instead, they smear his name upon false accounts and silence those who would uncover the artifice. Prynne knew the truth and died for it." "But Holmes," I asked, "why choose Chesil as victim? Surely there are many in Parliament who could serve as scapegoats." Holmes's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Because, Watson, Chesil is incorruptible. To stain his name is to cast suspicion upon all. It is the cleanest page upon which to spill the blot of ink. The psychology of forgers is ever the same. They choose a perfect sheet, believing the blemish will be more credible." The metaphor of impressions returned again, heavy with meaning. When we reached Baker Street once more, the clock marked past midnight. Holmes flung himself into his chair, drew a cigar from the Persian slipper, and smoked in sharp, quick puffs as he marshaled his thoughts. I dared not disturb him until at last he spoke. "There remains one witness uncalled, the cabman Judd. His vehicle was found abandoned, yet Judd himself is missing. I've already set a message with Lestrade to bring him if he's found. In the meantime, we must trace the scarred sentinel. His scar betrays not only violence, but regiment. A wound of that character is common among men of the Afghan campaigns. I shall consult the Gazette at dawn." As he spoke, a sound came from the hallway, the soft slide of paper beneath the door. Holmes was on it instantly, retrieving a folded slip that bore no superscription. He opened it, and I leaned over his shoulder. In rough characters were scrawled the words, "Leave Chesil or follow Prynne." Beneath it lay the crude impression of a hand smeared with ink. Holmes's lips curved in a grim smile. The threats grow picturesque, yet the fool who scrawled this leaves more trace than he knows. See how the letters tilt, the rightward slant, the cramped tails. It is the hand of a clerk trained in double-entry accounts, not the brute who shadows us. Again, the impression betrays the plate. He placed the slip carefully with the ledger. Watson, our adversaries blunder by pressing too hard. Each stroke deepens the indenture, and I shall read their whole confession before the type is spent. Sleep was impossible that night. Holmes sat brooding until the lamps burned low, then rose with sudden decision. "Watson, dress yourself. We go to the yard. If Judd has been found, he is the key. If not, then the key is turned against him, and we must discover who turned it." By dawn we were at Scotland Yard, where Lestrade received us with his habitual mixture of irritation and reluctant respect. He had news. "Your cabman's been taken, Holmes," he said. "Found unconscious near the docks, a bottle of gin by his side. But it wasn't gin that felled him, it was a blow to the head. He's roused now, and swears blind he was hired by a tall fellow with a scarred jaw. Paid him double fare to loiter near the temple. Then nothing, save he woke in the gutter." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And the fellow's description matches ours, of course." "Excellent, Lestrade. Judd is no accomplice, only another impression pressed into service. Yet the scarred man's persistence betrays his desperation. We press him, he will crack." Lestrade grumbled about scarce resources, but agreed to place watchers on the printers and to keep Chesil discreetly guarded. Holmes and I left, the city stirring now with the bustle of a new day. As we passed once more along the embankment, Holmes halted suddenly, his gaze fixed upon the parapet. There, etched faintly in chalk, was a symbol, the looped C we had seen beside the ledger figures. It had been drawn hastily, then rubbed as if in second thought. Holmes touched it gently. The mark of their fraternity. They leave it for each other as signal, careless of who might read. "Come, Watson. Tonight we must prepare the trap. The stage will be Baker Street itself, and our players shall enter whether they wish it or not." His eyes shone with that dangerous brilliance that always heralded the climax of his dramas. And as the fog drifted off the river, I felt that the shadow over Westminster Bridge had lengthened to touch even our own door. Holmes spoke little through the day, yet his silence was of that pregnant kind which brims with calculation. He moved restlessly from desk to window, from chemical table to armchair, every now and then making a note in his thin, crabbed hand, or adjusting the ledger upon the mantel as though it were a chess piece awaiting its decisive square. I knew the signs too well. He was shaping the trap of which he had spoken. By evening he had summoned Lestrade once more. The inspector arrived, spluttering at being called twice in one day, but Holmes cut short his protestations with a precision that left no room for delay. "Tonight, Lestrade, you will station 2 men at either end of Baker Street. No uniform, they must look like passers-by. You will wait in my rooms until I give you sign. For if my calculations are correct, the scarred sentinel will be compelled to act within these very walls before dawn." "And what of Sir Benedict?" I asked. Holmes's eyes flicked toward me. "He too must play his part. I've written to him with an invitation he cannot ignore. At 9 o'clock he shall arrive here and the curtain will rise. Our adversary has sown too many impressions. The type must crack under pressure." The appointed hour came. Sir Benedict Chesil was shown in, pale but composed, his bearing that of a man determined to face calumny with dignity. He shook my hand warmly, then looked to Holmes. "You have news?" Holmes motioned him to a chair. "Patience, Sir Benedict. The news will come, though not from my lips. We await another guest." Chesil frowned but obeyed. The silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional shuffle of Lestrade in the corner. At last came a firm tread upon the stair. The door opened, and in stepped the scarred sentinel himself, broad-shouldered, his jaw twisted by the seamed wound that ran from ear to chin. He carried himself with the stiff precision of a soldier, and his eyes swept the room in one quick, practiced glance. Holmes rose as though greeting a familiar acquaintance. "Good evening, Sergeant Rayner." The name startled me, but more so the man, for he stiffened, then relaxed, with a short laugh. You know me, then. Your scar is catalogued in the rolls of the Afghan campaign. You served under Colonel Maitland. Your discharge papers mention a tendency to irregular employment since. Now you serve another master. The man's lips curled. And what if I do? I came because you summoned me, not because I fear you. What is it you think you know? Holmes's hand moved to the mantel, resting upon the ledger. That you are no instigator, only the arm. But an arm cannot move without a brain. Tell us, Rayner, whose brain directs you? The man's gaze slid briefly to Chesil, then back to Holmes. Ask him, he growled. Ask your spotless parliamentarian. He and I know each other well enough. Chesil half rose, colour surging into his cheeks. That is a lie, he cried. I have never seen this man in my life. Holmes's eyes flickered, but his tone was mild. A convenient assertion, Rayner, but a clumsy one. For if you meant to destroy Chesil, you would not reveal yourself thus openly. You have been sent here to plant doubt, and doubt is ink, spread thin upon the page, but the impression, when pressed too often, betrays its falsity. The soldier's hand twitched toward his coat. Lestrade stepped forward, hand upon his truncheon, but Holmes raised a warning finger. No violence, Inspector. Sergeant Rayner is too valuable a witness alive. For a moment, the tension hung thick as the fog outside. Then, with a grunt, Rayner dropped heavily into a chair. You're devilish quick, Holmes. But what can you prove? A name in a ledger, a clerk dead, a warning note. Nothing ties me. Holmes leaned forward. On the contrary, everything ties you. The soot upon your boots links you to the cab at the Temple. The fibre upon Chesil's step links you to his house. The ink upon the curtain links you to the ledger itself. You are the impression that repeats across every page, Sergeant. You are the constant letter in a fraudulent type. Rayner's face darkened, but he said no more. At that instant, there came another knock upon the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a pale young man with hollow cheeks and nervous hands. He clutched a bundle of papers tied with string. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Ah, Mr. Elphinstone, he said softly. You have decided to tell your tale after all. The newcomer glanced fearfully at Rayner, then at Chesil. I could not keep silence. Prynne was my friend. I was the one who copied the figures for him. He said it was the only way to expose them. But when I heard he had been killed, I knew I was next. I have hidden ever since. Tonight, his voice broke. Tonight I saw Rayner following me again. I came here for safety. Holmes took the bundle and untied it. Inside were half a dozen sheets, each bearing carefully written columns of payments identical to those in the ledger. At the top of one page stood the word Chesil, later struck through. Holmes's voice was low but resonant. This, Watson, is the missing plate, the original impression. The ledger we seized was but a copy. The forger altered the type, inserting Chesil's name where none had stood. These sheets prove the fraud. Chesil sagged in his chair with relief. Rayner sprang to his feet, but Lestrade was upon him in a moment, clapping irons on his wrists. Take him below, Holmes ordered, but keep him safe. His masters will not forgive his capture. When the door closed behind them, Holmes turned to Elphinstone. You have risked much, young man. Tell me only this. Who directed you to make these copies? The clerk's eyes darted fearfully. It was Sir Evelyn Rathbury. He said it was for a confidential inquiry that the Treasury must know if funds were being diverted. But when I gave him the sheets, he warned me never to speak of it. Prynne said Rathbury meant to bury the truth, and that is why he went to you. Holmes nodded slowly. The stage is set, Watson. We have the arm, we have the witness, and we have the false type. But the brain remains, the man who directs from the Treasury offices. Tomorrow, we draw him into the open. I felt the weight of what lay ahead. For if Holmes was right, the corruption stretched to the very heart of Whitehall, and the shadow over Westminster Bridge was but the herald of a darker storm. Holmes laid the sheets upon the table, his fingers tapping lightly as though upon a telegraph key. "Impressions, Watson, impressions everywhere, but at last we hold the true plate. Tomorrow we strike it clean." He rose, drew the curtains against the fog, and extinguished the lamp. In the silence that followed, only the city's muffled hum reached us, as though London itself held its breath for what was to come. Holmes was already at his dressing-gown table when the first light of morning broke faintly through the fog. He had scarcely slept, yet his manner showed none of the dullness of fatigue. The bundle of Elphinstone's papers lay spread before him, weighted by the Persian slipper and his chemical retorts. He examined each page with a lens, his eyes glittering as he traced the faint indentations where the pen had pressed too hard. "Watson," he said abruptly, "note how the hand is even, deliberate, save in one spot. Here, the downward stroke trembles. It occurs not when the sums are written, but when the name is added. Whoever forged these entries did so with less confidence than the original writer. Rathbury may have ordered the work, but the hand was another's." I bent over the sheet, but my medical eye, trained to diagnose minute irregularities of pulse, could indeed detect the hesitation. A copyist unused to forgery, perhaps? Holmes's mouth curved in the faintest smile. Or a man who copied with fear upon him. There lies the seam, Watson, the place where the truth peeps through the garment of lies. Before I could reply, Lestrade was announced. He came in weary but triumphant, his boots muddy from the night's work. "Rayner's safe in the cells, Holmes. We caught a man skulking near them at dawn, likely aiming to finish him off. He slipped away, but we'll run him down yet." Holmes gave a curt nod. "Guard Rayner with your life, Lestrade. He is the hinge upon which the door swings. Without him, the play collapses. With him, the curtain must rise." Lestrade grunted, half amused, half irritated. "Always your plays and curtains, Holmes. But I'll humor you. What's the next move?" Holmes tapped the bundle of papers. "This morning, Sir Evelyn Rathbury shall receive an invitation to Baker Street. He believes himself to command the shadows, but he has overplayed his hand. It is time to bring him from the treasury to our little stage." By noon, Rathbury had come. He entered stiffly, with that air of officialdom which clings like starch to such men. He inclined his head to Holmes, but when his gaze fell upon Sir Benedict Chessel, summoned again at Holmes's insistence, his composure cracked for the briefest instant. "Sir Benedict, I did not expect—" "Nor I you," Chessel retorted with icy dignity. "Yet it seems our names are coupled in a ledger of infamy." Holmes gestured for silence, then laid the forged ledger and the true copies side by side upon the table. "Here are the impressions," he said coolly. "One genuine, one false. Sir Evelyn, you will explain why you caused young Elphinstone to make these transcripts and why the name of Chessel was inserted in place of another." Rathbury's face stiffened, but his lips quivered. "This is preposterous. I never—" "Spare us the denial," Holmes cut in sharply. "The copies bear the mark of hesitation where the false name intrudes. The pen trembled, not from ignorance, but from guilt. You compelled the hand, Sir Evelyn, and you profited by its impression." The official drew himself up, recovering something of his habitual hauteur. "I acted for the good of the service. Funds were passing irregularly, and I sought to trace them. I—" "Sought to bury them," Holmes interjected, his eyes gleaming. "When Prynne discovered the truth, you loosed Rayner upon him, and when the corpse threatened scandal, you sent warnings under the very lamps of Whitehall, hoping to frighten me into silence." Rathbury's lips pressed into a thin line. "You cannot prove this." Holmes's hand fell upon the bundle. "Proof lies in every sheet. Elphinstone will testify that you ordered the copies. Rayner will confess under questioning who paid his hire. The chalk mark upon the embankment, the ink upon the cab curtain, the soot upon the ledger shop, all are impressions of your crime. You have left more type than you imagined, Sir Evelyn, and the page spells your ruin." For the first time, the mask cracked. His hand shook as he gripped the chair, and a bead of sweat traced his temple. Yet even in that moment, a hard light burned in his eyes. "If I fall, Holmes, I do not fall alone. There are others, men whose names command more weight than mine. You will drag them down as well." Holmes regarded him coldly. "That may be so. But justice is not a selective press. It prints the guilty alike. Your fear confirms what your words deny. The trap is sprung." Cecil rose, his face a mixture of outrage and vindication. "You would stain me to shield yourself, Rathbury, but now the stain is washed clean." Holmes inclined his head toward Lestrade. "Inspector, the play ends for this actor. Take him." Lestrade moved forward, but Rathbury suddenly thrust his hand inside his coat. In an instant, Holmes was upon him, wrenching away a small revolver concealed there. He handed it to Lestrade with a look of scorn. "So much for dignity," he murmured. "Even your weapon bears the impression of cowardice." Rathbury sagged, defeated, as Lestrade took him into custody. Yet Holmes's expression was not one of triumph. He stood by the fire, his gaze distant, as though the case had revealed not victory, but some darker truth. When the door closed behind them, I ventured to speak. "Holmes, you have the man. The shadow is lifted." He shook his head slowly. "Not lifted, Watson. Merely shortened. Rathbury is but one figure upon the page. There are others whose names remain hidden, whose ink runs deeper. We have torn away the first sheet, but the book is long, and the type is cunning." He turned to the window, where the fog still clung to the panes. "Tonight, Watson, we prepare. The true confrontation is yet to come." And as he spoke, the bell below rang sharply once more. A telegram was delivered, sealed in red. Holmes tore it open, read swiftly, and handed it to me. The message was stark. Another death. Blackfriars. Come at once. Holmes's eyes burned with fierce intensity. "The shadows lengthen, Watson. This is the second act." We hurried through the shrouded streets in a hansom, the horses' hooves striking sharp echoes along the riverfront. Holmes sat taut and silent beside me, the telegram still crushed in his hand. His profile was set in that grim concentration which told me he had already leapt ahead of the facts, shaping a theory into which this new death must fit. I longed to question him, but his eyes were fixed upon the fog, as though reading invisible letters upon its drifting scrolls. At Blackfriars, the constables had cordoned a narrow lane behind the printing houses. The lamps cast a dim circle on cobblestones slick with mist. In their midst lay a body, half sprawled against the wall. Holmes knelt at once, brushing back the coat from the dead man's chest. It was the printer we had confronted days before, the ink-stained fellow who had begged us to spare him. His features were fixed in a rictus of terror, the eyes staring glassily at the night. A smear of black pigment stained his lips as though forced between them in his last moments. Holmes touched it with his finger, sniffed and murmured, "Lamp black again," but thickened with gum arabic. Not swallowed by choice, he was silenced by the very medium of his trade. I shuddered. Poison? No, merely suffocation by paste. Quick, silent, and fitting for a printer turned inconvenient. Holmes's gaze traveled swiftly over the man's clothing. He plucked at the sleeve where faint scratches marked the fabric. Fingernail striations. He fought, however briefly. And look here, Watson, the corner of a page, caught within the cuff. With delicate care, he withdrew a torn scrap of paper. Its edge bore the ruled lines of a ledger, and across it sprawled half a word. Meant. Holmes's eyes gleamed. They tried to erase more than a man. They meant to erase a record. And yet, Like all careless forgers, they leave the impression behind. We followed the constable into the print room from which the body had been dragged. The place was in chaos. Type scattered across the floor, sheets half burnt in the grate, ledgers flung open as though in frantic search. Holmes examined the ashes, lifting one charred fragment with the tongs. On it, just visible, was the tail of a capital letter, R. "Rathbury again, or someone wishing us to believe it," Holmes murmured. "But recall, Watson, that even when the type is broken, its edges reveal the mold. This was staged. The true record is elsewhere." We left the scene under Lestrade's gruff orders. The inspector was harried, caught between satisfaction at holding Rathbury and irritation at another corpse, complicating matters. Holmes promised his assistance, then drew me aside as we stepped back into the fog. "Watson, do you perceive the design? Each death is but a line struck through the ledger of conspiracy. First Prynne, now the printer. Each held a fragment of truth. When all fragments are gone, the book is clean, save for the false name of Chesil. Our adversary means not only to profit, but to rewrite history itself." I followed his reasoning with awe, though dread pressed upon me. "Then we must preserve the living witnesses at all cost." "Precisely. That means Elphinstone." We returned to Baker Street, where the nervous clerk sat hunched, clutching his bundle as though it were a lifeline. Holmes spoke to him gently, with that rare tone he used for the most fragile of clients. "You must not stir from here, Mr. Elphinstone. The streets are dangerous ground. They will seek you next, for you hold the only unbroken impression of their crime." The clerk nodded miserably. "I will do as you say, Mr. Holmes, but the men I saw, Rayner, Rathbury, they are but agents. There is another, greater still, who walks above them." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "You have seen him?" "Once. He came to the shop, cloaked and veiled, but when he spoke, I knew. His voice carried authority. It was—" He faltered, paling. Holmes raised a hand. "Do not force yourself, not yet. Soon you shall say it before witnesses. That moment will come." He turned away, pacing the rug, then halted abruptly. "Watson, prepare yourself. Tonight we test the last link. If I err, the chain breaks. If not, the entire net will tighten." Before I could question further, a knock sounded. Lestrade entered, grim-faced. "Holmes, Rathbury's dead." The words struck us silent. "How?" Holmes demanded at last. "Hanged himself in his cell, or so it seems. But I swear the knot was tied too well for his clumsy fingers. Either way, he'll never speak now." Holmes's jaw tightened. Convenient indeed. One more witness struck from the page. "Do you not see, Lestrade? You are chasing shadows while the true hand moves, freely." The inspector bristled, but Holmes was already striding to the mantel. He seized the ledger and the copies, gathering them into his arm. His voice rang with sudden decision. "It is time. Watson, fetch your revolver. Elphinstone, steel your courage. Tonight we attend upon the very heart of Whitehall. The book must be read in its true light." By 9 o'clock we were at Somerset House, the grand edifice looming over the river with its endless corridors and echoing chambers. Holmes had secured a private room by means of one of his mysterious notes, and there he laid out the documents upon a long oak table. Chesil joined us, his face grave but resolute. Lestrade arrived soon after with his 2 constables, grumbling but compliant. Holmes dimmed the lamps so that only the central table was lit. The rest of the chamber lay in shadow. He placed the ledger open at the page where Chesil's name had been struck through, beside Elphinstone's clean copy. Then he seated us as though for a tribunal, with himself at the head. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "the play begins. We wait now for our final actor. He will come, for he cannot allow these impressions to survive." The silence stretched. The air grew thick. Then, at last, the latch of the far door lifted with a slow, deliberate creak. A tall figure entered, cloaked, his face half in shadow. The door closed behind him with a hollow thud, and his voice carried across the chamber, resonant and commanding. "You are meddling where you ought not, Mr. Holmes. The records you clutch are trifles, meaningless scrawls. Destroy them now, and you may yet preserve your peace." Holmes did not rise. He merely gestured to the documents. "Come closer, my lord. You cannot erase your own impression so easily." The figure stepped into the light, and I drew a sharp breath as recognition dawned. It was no minor official. It was a peer of the realm, seated high in government, his face known from portraits and debates alike. Holmes's eyes gleamed with fierce anticipation. The true confrontation had begun. The peer of the realm advanced into the light, his cloak falling back to reveal the unmistakable features of Lord Henbury, Under-Secretary of the Exchequer. His reputation in the House was one of austerity and probity. His speeches, dry but respected, carried weight in the nation's coffers. Yet the look he cast upon Holmes now was not the glance of a public servant, but of a cornered man. Holmes rose at last, his tall figure etched sharply against the lamplight. "Lord Henbury," he said quietly, "your ledger lies open. Every line, every impression, points toward you. You may deny, but the type betrays its master." The nobleman's lip curled. "You speak of impressions, Mr. Holmes. You forget that impressions may be forged. That is what you hold, false scrawls devised to smear an honorable name." Holmes inclined his head. "Indeed, forgery has been employed, but the forgery was yours. You sought to lay the stain upon Sir Benedict Chessel, thinking the contrast of his spotless reputation would lend plausibility. Yet in your arrogance you left a trail of impressions none but a fool would miss. The ink upon the cab curtain, the soot upon the ledger house door, the chalk mark upon the embankment. These are not mere accidents. They are the stamps of your conspiracy." Lord Henbury's eyes flickered toward the document spread on the table, then to the pale Elphinstone who shrank under his gaze. "So the little clerk has turned Judas," he said coldly. "You have not learned, boy, that silence is survival." Holmes interposed himself swiftly. "Enough threats, my lord. You forget that we are not in the lobbies of Parliament, but in a chamber where truth, not expediency, is master. You will answer to the evidence." Lestrade, who had sat glowering, now rose with unexpected vigor. "And answer you will, Lord Henbury. I have men enough to see you held till morning, and by then the charge will be formal." Henbury gave a short, bitter laugh. "Charges? Against me? The yard cannot move without the sanction of the very office I hold. You grasp at shadows, gentlemen. The machine of government will grind your accusations to dust." Holmes's gaze sharpened, a gleam of triumph in his eyes. "There you betray yourself again, my lord. For you speak of machines, yet your crime is written in the very language of machines, the printing press. You use the secrecy of treasury contracts to employ printers for your shadow ledgers, thinking no eye would pierce the smoke. Yet you overlooked the simplest truth. Every press leaves its unique impression, just as every hand leaves its peculiar stroke. I've already compared the indentation on Elphinstone's sheets with the forged ledger. They were struck upon different machines. The forgery was introduced later, at your direction." The nobleman's color rose, then fell, as if the ground beneath him shifted. Still he fought. "You cannot produce witnesses." Holmes gestured to Elphinstone. "Here is one, trembling but resolute. He will testify that Rathbury gave him his orders. Rathbury, in turn, was your subordinate, and your hand directed his. As for Rayner, your soldier, he sits in the yard, ready to confess whose purse paid his hire. Shall I recount the sums? £25, then 50, in precise intervals, drawn from your own discretionary accounts. The impressions match." For the first time, Lord Henbury faltered. He gripped the back of a chair, his knuckles whitening, his breath uneven. Chessel, who had remained silent till now, rose and faced him with controlled fury. "You would sacrifice me," Henbury, you who sat beside me in the House, who pledged reform, you dared smear my name for your own foul profit? Henbury's eyes darted, his composure crumbling. I sought only to contain a dangerous revelation. Funds were moving, yes, but for purposes beyond you, matters of state. If the public had known, the government would have tottered. Better one man's reputation than the nation's stability. Holmes's voice rang out, cold and precise. There, Watson, you hear the philosophy of corruption. To forge the page in the name of order, to murder in the name of stability. But the truth, my lord, is simpler. You lined your own purse. The columns of figures are not secret disbursements of the state. They are bribes, paid for contracts and favors. You killed to preserve not England, but yourself. The silence in that chamber was suffocating. Only the faint crackle of the lamp and the pounding of my own heart marked the passage of moments. Henbury's head sank lower, his breath ragged. Then with sudden violence, he snatched at the ledger as if to tear it across. But Holmes was swifter. He slammed his hand upon the volume, forcing it flat upon the table. Lestrade stepped forward, iron clinking at his belt. "Enough," the inspector barked. "Lord Henbury, you'll come with me. Whatever your rank, the law's no respecter of it." The nobleman looked about wildly, as though seeking some exit in the shadows. But the doors were guarded, the windows barred. His shoulders sagged, and he let himself be led away. When the chamber had emptied, leaving only Holmes, myself, and Sir Benedict, the silence felt heavier still. Cecil grasped Holmes's hand, his voice thick with gratitude. "You have saved me, Mr. Holmes, not only my name, but my very soul from ruin." Holmes accepted the thanks with a grave nod. "It was not your soul that required saving, Sir Benedict, but the record of truth. The forgers may strike through the lines, but the impressions remain. That is the lesson of this case." We returned to Baker Street in the small hours. Holmes threw himself into his chair, weary yet restless, his eyes still lit by that peculiar flame which never wholly abates until every chord is resolved. He looked into the fire, his violin leaning mute in the corner, and murmured half to himself, "It is always the same, Watson. Men imagine they can alter the ledger of fact as they alter the ledgers of finance. But paper retains its scars, and truth is the watermark that no forger can efface." I made no answer, for my own thoughts were heavy with what we had witnessed, the death of innocence, the corruption at the very summit of office, the peril Holmes had courted. Yet even in that weight I felt the awe that ever accompanies him, his unerring eye for detail, his relentless pursuit of the fact beneath appearances. The fire burned low. Outside, the faint rattle of a milk cart passed in the dawn. Holmes rose at last, stretched his lean frame, and turned to me with the faintest of smiles. "Rest, Watson. The case is nearly ended. Yet mark me, there is one impression still withheld, one line not yet spoken. Tomorrow I shall reveal it. Then the ledger shall be balanced." He turned back to the window, staring into the whitening fog. And I, with a foreboding I could not quite name, felt that the true climax was yet to come. Holmes remained at the window for a long while, the pale light of dawn creeping through the fog outside, limning his features in austere relief. I sat in my chair, fatigue pressing heavily upon me, yet unable to take my eyes from him. He had spoken of one impression withheld, one line not yet spoken, and I knew from old experience that until that final note was struck, the symphony of the case would not be complete. At last he turned, his gaze fixed upon the documents laid neatly upon the table, the ledger, the copies, the telegrams and threats, all arranged with a meticulousness that mirrored his own thought. He beckoned me. "Watson, you have followed me through every twist of this shadow play. You have seen the bodies fall, the false names struck, the true names emerge. But do you recall, from the very beginning, one small clue that I have carried with me, silent and unspoken?" I searched my memory, replaying the moments. The scrap of paper on Westminster Bridge, the pigment smeared into Prynne's sleeve, the chalk mark upon the embankment. I shook my head. Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely, my dear fellow. You have forgotten it as they wished you to. But I did not. It lies here." He drew from his pocket the original scrap he had taken at Westminster Bridge, the fragment with the ink stain and the faint column of numbers. He placed it beside the ledger. "Look carefully. Do you see the difference?" I bent low. The two seemed almost identical. Columns of payments, initials scrawled at the margins. But under Holmes's guiding finger, I noticed what had eluded me before. A watermark, faint and spectral, visible only when held at the right angle to the lamp. "A crown," I said. "Just so. The paper is government issue, marked for official treasury memoranda. Yet the ledger itself is printed upon common millstock, without mark. Therefore, the page torn from Prynne's hand came not from the forger's book, but from an authentic treasury ledger. In short, Watson, the payments were real. Rathbury and Henbury did not invent them from whole cloth. They existed. Their crime was to divert them, disguise them, and to smear Chesil as scapegoat when discovery loomed." I gasped. "Then there are others still, others who received these payments." Holmes's eyes gleamed with somber fire. "There are always others. But their names lie beyond the reach of this case. Our duty was to tear away the mask before us, not to scour every shadowed corridor of Whitehall. That task belongs to history, which keeps its own relentless ledger." At that moment, Lestrade arrived, wearier than ever, but with an odd mixture of triumph and disquiet in his expression. "Henbury's secured, Holmes. He raves about politics and necessity, but we have his hand clear enough. It'll be a nasty business for the government, though. There'll be pressure to quiet it." Holmes inclined his head. "So there always is. But truth, once printed, cannot be unprinted. The impression remains." Lestrade gave a grunt, part respect, part irritation. "You've done it again, Holmes, though the devil take me if I'll ever know how you sniffed it out from a smear of ink." When he had gone, Sir Benedict Chesil himself was shown in. He looked years older than when we had first met him, yet his step was steady. He grasped Holmes's hand warmly. "You have given me back my honor, Mr. Holmes. I shall never forget it. If I may serve you." Holmes raised a hand. "No service is required, Sir Benedict, only that you continue to be the incorruptible page upon which the nation may rely. They chose you as victim precisely because your integrity was spotless. Guard it well, for there will always be those who seek to blot it." Chesil bowed and departed. The room grew still once more. Holmes threw himself into his chair, steepling his long fingers, and regarded the fire. "It is a curious thing, Watson," he said at length. "This case began with a corpse on a bridge, a mere scrap of paper, a smear of ink. From these impressions we traced a conspiracy that reached to the Exchequer itself. And yet the greatest truth of all is not Henbury's guilt, nor Rathbury's death, nor even the ledger's forgery. It is the demonstration, repeated eternally, that no man may erase his impressions from the world. Every act leaves its trace, as every letter leaves its indenture on the page beneath." I nodded, moved by his gravity. "And what of Prynne, Holmes, the poor clerk who died for seeking the truth?" Holmes's eyes softened for a moment. "He will not be remembered by the world, Watson, but we remember him. And perhaps, in some larger reckoning, his death will weigh more than Henbury's speeches or Rathbury's accounts. For he tried, in his small way, to set the record straight." We sat in silence, each with our own reflections. Outside, the fog lifted slowly from the streets, revealing London stirring into the bustle of another day. Yet to me the city seemed changed, less solid, more haunted, as though beneath every ledger and ledger stone lay hidden impressions no one could wholly erase. Holmes rose at last, restless as ever after the solving of a great problem. He paced the room, then turned abruptly with a gleam in his eye. "Watson, You may put away your notes of this affair. The shadows over Westminster Bridge are dispelled. But the air is full of rumours. Telegrams arrive hourly, and the knock at our door is never long delayed. Even as he spoke, there came the sound he foretold. A sharp rap upon the door below, urgent and insistent. Mrs. Hudson's step sounded on the stair. Holmes smiled faintly, his lean face alive again with the prospect of new pursuit. There it is, Watson, the next impression, waiting to be read. I reached for my pen, already feeling the tug of curiosity overcoming the weariness in my bones. For when Sherlock Holmes rose to answer a summons, I knew another tale was already pressing at the margins, eager to be written. The door opened. A new case had arrived.